It's my feel-good breakfast show.
Such official music. Eitan Stern could be Thor. It's like Avengers music.
Just missing a hammer, actually. Wow.
I'll bring a hammer next time.
Okay, well,
I've never been allowed to let my hair down on the show, but one day.
Just picturing you like the law is the law.
There we go. And you know what? You are just in time. Welcome to your Feel Good Breakfast Show. We are now turning our focus to the importance of bees in our ecosystem today and the vital role they play in the pollination of the world's food. We are also having a look at the sector of the food production industry that relies on animals, as we don't usually spare thought on how it all works.
Yeah, so true. So we're calling upon the legal guidance of our friend and expert in law, the director at Legalities.co.za, Thor. He's here to answer our questions on how does the food I eat legally end up on my plate. Eitan Stern in the building, man. Good morning to you, brother.
Good to be here.
Oh, well, listen, let's unpack this. Has the law changed around the decline in the bee population? Has that had an impact on legislation at the moment?
Yeah, so totally. So as we've all come to understand, natural resources are limited and people can't just do what they want anymore. These things need to be managed, and that's food, that's fish, that's mining, that's definitely bees and animals. These things need to be managed. So all over the world, and South Africa included, you've now got regulations to ensure that people protect the natural environment. So in South Africa, for bees, you've got the Conservation Protection Act, which defines what we're allowed to do with our land. So you don't just destroy all the biodiversity, which means the bees would die. You've also got the Agricultural Pests Act, which shows what you're supposed to do when bee farming to ensure disease doesn't spread. So we've had to adapt to ensure that we don't kill the bees, because if you kill the bees, you don't just kill honey, but you kill all food, because they germinate food. So you essentially kill all of us. So the laws have had to adapt, and hopefully they will continue to adapt further.
Yeah, now you mentioned these laws, which I absolutely love. Now, on top of that, we also have a regulatory body that kind of is involved when it comes to bees in our country. So that's the South African Bee Industry Organization,
Yes.
I believe, right? So if you mentioned I have land and you're looking at conservation, I make the decision to, in my personal capacity, maybe start a beehive, or vice versa, maybe the other end of the scale, a huge organization, I want to start a company.
Yeah.
Which of those scenarios requires me to register that beehive or the production of it? And is there a certain sort of prerequisite?
Sure. So they're not a regulator, but they're an industry body. And you find these industry bodies in lots of different industries in order to kind of try and manage the interests in that industry. So membership is not an obligation, but whether you're a member or not, you still have to obey the rules. And they're there to ensure that everyone's got a voice in the industry, to liaise between the beekeepers and the government. They're there to spread information and do a whole lot of other sorts of things in order to kind of manage that industry. So these regulatory bodies, they do important work because they help the industry as a whole to function. They don't necessarily make the laws, but they might propose different laws or new laws. So certainly if you're into beekeeping, it's probably worth finding out about them, maybe possibly get registered, and certainly if you're going to be on a big scale, get registered. But if you have just one hive at home, follow what the rules are, but there's no obligation to be registered.
Okay.
Very interesting. Now, I know a lot of people are also, we want to look after our planet. We want to look after our limited resources, our natural resources. Now, has certain practices been put in place when it comes to sustainably and responsibly sourced? So, for example, in the fishing industry, what kind of practices are in place? Like if they have a permit, are they only allowed to fish a certain amount or in a certain area? How are the bodies controlling it?
Okay, cool. So yeah, so look, we have on Earth today like a crisis when it comes to the oceans. So the only way to really ensure that we're not destroying the oceans is to stop eating fish altogether. But what government has done is they've tried to put laws in place in order to manage the oceans. So certainly large-scale fisheries and fishing companies, they have permits around the amount of fish they can catch and where they can catch, and small-scale fishermen also require licensing, and there are limits on what they can catch. So it's certainly no one is allowed to take anything from the ocean unless you are licensed. And the government does try its best to manage it, but the problem is at a catastrophic scale. So really, the only way to ensure that you're protecting the ocean is to not eat anything from it. But if you are going to eat something from the ocean, the WWF has a program called SASSI, where they have listed the different types of fish into a green, red, and orange list. And so green would be a sustainable a fish from a sustainable, fishing colony, and red would be don't eat it at all. So it's really important, if you are going to eat fish, to ensure that you go and make sure that you're only eating sustainably caught fish. But in general, if you want to protect the oceans and ensure that we don't die in a couple of years, then don't eat fish and don't eat single-use plastic, which is just polluting the oceans.
Yeah, man. Great advice always coming through from Eitan himself. But we will be chatting to you a little bit later, man. Thank you so much for your time. We're talking about the legalities around food, what it means and how it gets to our plate. And I think with that information, there's only one more thing to do. Let's eat.
It's my feel-good breakfast show.
You tuned into your feel-good breakfast show, Expresso, and we are continuing our discussion with lawyer and director at Legalese.co.za, that's Eitan Stern, as he breaks down the legal ins and outs of how food is produced here in South Africa.
Yeah, man.
I hope it's still a feel-good breakfast show after this talk.
Oh, listen, this is a very important discussion to have, because
Yes,
I don't
for
think
sure.
a lot of people think the food just comes off the shelf at the store.
100%.
Yeah. Now, we have all these industries that we're talking about, and when we touched on like the beekeeping side of things and honey, there's so many different factions of this. One I wanted to chat about is the milk and dairy production, which is a big industry on its own, of course.
Totally.
What is the legislature behind that when it comes to any regulations? I mean, if I take the example of our country where we have small farming all the way up to the big scale, we have peeps with 2 cows in the yard and they may be milking the cow. Do they need to have some sort of a permit or regulation or something in that instant?
Okay, so cow milk needs to be regulated. What we all need to remember is when we're drinking milk, it came from a live animal. And essentially, milk drinking is so widespread that the production on milk is massive. So you definitely require laws, and we definitely have laws around keeping the industry safe. If you are producing milk in order to sell it, you do need to be registered as a dairy producer. But if you have a personal cow or cows and you're not selling it and using it for yourself or your family, then you don't need to be registered. Yeah. But in any event, the laws and the regulations that are there to ensure that the produce, that the milk doesn't kill us and it keeps us healthy. It's not there to ensure that the animals lived in any sort of humane conditions. So, we just as dairy consumers just have to remember that, often what it looks like on the packaging is not necessarily the conditions that the milk came from.
So it's actually quite interesting that, the regulations and the rules in place is to protect us, but not necessarily that of the animals.
Yeah.
Now, when it comes to, the poultry industry, our chickens and our eggs, I know that there's also a lot of them are, like you mentioned off air, that a lot of them are bred in like tiny, tiny little ones. And of course, the goal and the one that people always love is free-range eggs.
Yes.
So how's legislation protecting that industry?
Okay, cool. So again, it protects us in the industry to make sure that we have good produce. It doesn't protect the animals in any way. And you can pretty much assume that if you're eating chicken or eggs in this country, that unless you are sourcing it directly from a farm or very close to home, that you can assume that the animals lived in some sort of inhumane conditions. They're raised in battery cages, that are towered in massive factories of battery cages that are towered on top of each other. What does free range mean? Well, free range means, unfortunately, very little. There isn't actually a legislated definition, as far as I know, of free range. So every farmer that produces free range is giving their own interpretation for what free range means, and it generally means some aspect of access to the outside world, but it doesn't necessarily mean, what it looks like on the box of chickens roaming around a field. So, it's really important if you are eating eggs, try source it as close as you can to home from a farm if possible. Get your own chicken if you possibly can. But definitely, like, it's worth, you know, understanding where the food comes from.
Yeah, and I think it's also just a unique opportunity as well to support small business,
Totally.
especially in this time that we're living in right now. I think a lot of people have maybe taken new opportunities. So again, if you do have that connection, you can definitely support them too.
100%.
And speaking of this, another industry which is huge in South Africa is the meat industry, which I
Yes.
believe is something in excess of like a 44 billion rand industry per year in South
Yes.
Africa alone. What does it mean when it comes to actually purchasing meat? How do we know that there's this level of anti-cruelty that has been ensured in procuring and getting this meat to the point where it's on my plate?
Sure. So, I mean, in short, you basically can't. Pretty much any meat that you're going to be eating from like a commercial sense, unless you're sourcing directly from a farm, is going to be killed. And I mean, we can talk about what ethical means, but the animal's going to have lived a horrible life and died in a horrible way. But the regulations around meat are there again to make sure that we stay safe, so the produce will be safe, and it's unbelievably complex. The size of the meat industry, it's very complex to make sure that the meat stays is safe when it gets to us. So the laws are there, and the farmers stick to the laws in order to make sure we're safe. But generally, that's not going to mean anything for the actual condition of the animals. So the only way for us to ensure that we eat meat in an ethical way would be source it as close as you can to the source. Cut down on meat. There's some unbelievable alternatives out there. Vegetarianism is not going to kill you. You don't need to go vegetarian, but you can, you know, cut down the amount of meat that you eat. So the laws are there to make sure we stay safe, but we need to really discover, you know, what it means to eat meat ethically. That's a different question.
And also just question, where is our produce coming from? I think
Totally.
a lot of us don't do that. I'm a lazy shopper. I go to the store and I get my eggs there. So definitely thank you for shedding the light on that.
Sure.
Eitan Stern, aka Thor. There we go. Of course, we were just unpacking the legalities around food production in South Africa. It is also World Bee Day, and we're going to continue that conversation throughout the show.